The auctioneer's voice was a brisk, merciless drumbeat, each word a hammer blow against the coffin of Lauren Carter's life. She stood at the back of the sterile, crowded auction room, a ghost at her own family's funeral. The gleaming stainless steel vats, the complex machinery, the very logo of Carter Pharmaceuticals, her grandfather's legacy, her father's life's work, was all being sold off, piece by painful piece, to the highest bidder. Her mind flashed back to the headlines from 3 months ago, a nightmare reel of corporate warfare. Sinclair Medical Engineers, hostile takeover of ailing Carter Pharma. Dr. Edward Sinclair, a man she had never met but whose name was now etched onto her heart with acid, had been surgical in his attack. He had bought up their debt, shorted their stock, and bled them dry with a precision that was both brilliant and monstrous. He hadn't just defeated them. He had dismantled them. A sharp gasp from her aunt beside her pulled her back to the present. A large man in a suit was helping her father into a chair. His face was ashen, his hand clutching his chest. The stress, the public humiliation, it was too much. The fall of his company was causing the failure of his heart. The days that followed were a blur of hospital corridors that smelled of antiseptic and despair. Her father had survived the heart attack, but the prognosis was grim. He needed surgery, extensive care, and the family's insurance was gone, another casualty of the bankruptcy. They were drowning in debt, with the hospital demanding payment up front. That's when the shark returned to the water. A lawyer, his suit as sharp and gray as his eyes, arrived at the hospital. He represented Dr. Edward Sinclair. Dr. Sinclair is prepared to offer a final merger agreement, the lawyer said, his voice devoid of all emotion. He slid a thick, leather-bound contract across the small table in the bleak hospital waiting room. Lauren stared at it, her blood running cold. We have nothing left to merge. On the contrary, the lawyer replied smoothly. Dr. Sinclair is prepared to absorb all of Carter Pharmaceuticals' outstanding debts. He will also personally oversee and fund the entirety of your father's medical care, ensuring he receives the best treatment in the country. The offer was a lifeline, an impossible miracle. Lauren's heart skipped a beat with a hope she hadn't felt in months. But she knew men like Sinclair didn't offer miracles. They offered deals. And in return, she asked, her voice trembling. The lawyer opened the contract to the final page, pushing it toward her. The primary asset in this merger, he said, his gaze unwavering, is you. Lauren looked down. It was a marriage contract. The room tilted. The air grew thin. He wanted to marry her. The man who had destroyed her family, who had put her father in this very hospital bed, wanted to own her, to make her a final, triumphant acquisition. A wave of pure, unadulterated hatred, so potent it was almost a physical force, washed over her. She wanted to scream, to tear the contract to shreds, to claw the smug look off the lawyer's face. But then she thought of her father, lying in the room down the hall, his life hanging in the balance. She thought of the hospital administrator who had spoken to her that morning, his voice full of cold clinical pity as he explained their payment policies. She was trapped, utterly and completely trapped. With a hand that shook with a fury she could barely contain, she took the pen the lawyer offered. She signed her name on the dotted line, the ink a black stain on her soul. She pushed the contract back across the table. She didn't look at the lawyer. She looked out the window, at the cold, grey city that now belonged to Edward Sinclair. I will be your ruin, Edward Sinclair, she whispered to herself, the words a silent, venomous vow. I will sign your name. I will live in your house, and I will burn your empire to the ground from the inside out. The wedding was a transaction, conducted with the sterile efficiency of a corporate merger. It took place in a judge's chambers, a soulless room of dark wood and dusty law books. Lauren wore a simple, elegant white dress she had bought on sale, a stark contrast to the impeccably tailored Tom Ford suit Edward wore. He stood beside her, a statue of bored indifference, his handsome face a mask of cool detachment. The judge droned on, the words of the ceremony meaningless and hollow. Lauren's responses were automatic, whispered from a place deep inside her that had gone numb. The only thing that felt real was the burning hatred in her heart. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Edward didn't even look at her. The moment was a cold, empty void. Outside the courthouse, however, the world was putting on a different show. A frenzy of reporters and photographers, tipped off by Sinclair's PR team, descended upon them. The headlines the next day would scream about the wedding of the century, a stunning romantic union of two of the city's most powerful families, a merger of empires. "Smile, darling," Edward murmured, his voice a low, silken threat as the camera flashes exploded around them. He slid an arm around her waist, his touch firm, possessive. "The world is watching. Your performance today determines your family's comfort tomorrow." The veiled threat sent a fresh wave of fury through her. She forced a brilliant, dazzling smile onto her face, playing the part of the adoring bride. She leaned into him, her hand on his chest, a perfect picture of marital bliss for the cameras. But her eyes, when they met his, were chips of ice. He drove them from the courthouse himself, his expensive sports car a silent, speeding bullet through the city streets. He took her not to a home, but to a fortress. His mansion was a breathtaking masterpiece of modern architecture, a palace of glass, steel, and cold polished stone that overlooked the city like a predator from its perch. He gave her a brief, impersonal tour. "Your rooms are in the East Wing," he said, gesturing down a long, echoing hallway. "Mine are in the West. You will have a full staff at your disposal, a limitless credit card, and access to anything you require. In return, you will be presentable, you will be discreet, and you will be convincing." He stopped outside a set of large double doors. "This is you." He left her there. The East Wing was a self-contained luxury apartment, larger than her family's entire house. It was beautiful, opulent, and utterly soulless. It was a gilded cage. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. She was Mrs. Edward Sinclair, the wife of the man she had sworn to destroy. That evening, she prepared for the wedding night, her stomach in knots. She expected to be ignored, to be left alone in her gilded cage, a final, dismissive act of his power. She put on a simple silk nightgown, the fabric cool against her skin, and waited for the lonely night to begin. At precisely 10 p.m., her bedroom door opened. It was Edward. He stood in the doorway, his expression serious, unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm and devoid of any emotion. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. This was it, the humiliation, the final assertion of his ownership. He walked into the room, his presence seeming to suck all the air out of it. He stopped a few feet from her, his eyes coolly assessing her. "Take off the robe," he said. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Are you enjoying this story? Don't forget to hit subscribe and help us grow. Thank you for being here." Lauren's blood ran cold. "Take off the robe." The 4 words hung in the air, a quiet, brutal command. This was it. The ultimate humiliation. The assertion of his ownership. The final act in his conquest of her family. Her hands, trembling with a mixture of rage and fear, went to the knot of the silk sash at her waist. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her cower. With her chin held high, she let the robe slide from her shoulders, it pooling in a soft, white heap at her feet. She stood before him in a simple, knee-length chemise, her body rigid, her eyes burning with a defiant hatred. She braced herself for a lecherous gaze, a cruel smirk, a dismissive comment about his new acquisition. He did none of those things. His eyes, sharp and analytical, scanned her, but not with desire. It was the detached, clinical gaze of a doctor examining a patient. His focus narrowed, settling on a spot just below her right shoulder. He took a step closer, his proximity making her flinch. He reached out, not to touch her, but to point. "There," he said, his voice quiet, intense. "That." She glanced down. He was pointing at a tiny, faint scar, a silvery white line barely an inch long, a mark she had had for so long she often forgot it was there. It was from a childhood fall, or so her parents had always told her. "A scar from a fall?" she asked, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Is this what this is about? An inventory of my imperfections?" "That's not from a fall," he said, ignoring her tone. He dropped his hand, his eyes never leaving the mark. "I know what that is. It's a keloid scar, a specific type of tissue reaction. It's a marker." "A marker for what?" she snapped, her patience gone. He finally lifted his gaze from her shoulder to her face. His eyes were dark, serious, and held a strange, unnerving intensity. "It's the marker for a failed clinical trial," he said, his voice low and even. "A trial for a heart medication your father's company was developing about 15 years ago. A drug called cardio-regan." The name hit her like a physical blow. Cardio-regan. She vaguely remembered hearing it whispered in her house as a child, always in hushed, anxious tones. A project that had been quietly shelved, a failure her father never spoke of. How could you possibly know that?" she stammered, her defiance crumbling into confusion. "Because I've spent the last 5 years of my life, and millions of dollars, investigating it," he said, his voice turning hard as steel. "I know that cardio-regan was a revolutionary drug that showed incredible promise. I also know that in the final stages of its human trials, it produced a dangerous, sometimes fatal side effect in a small percentage of test subjects. A side effect that was preceded by the appearance of this exact type of scar at the injection site." He took another step closer, his presence overwhelming. "I know that your father, instead of reporting the adverse effects and pulling the drug, buried the data. He paid off the families of the victims, swore the doctors to silence, and shelved the project, hiding the evidence of his fraud to avoid a scandal that would have ruined him." Lauren felt dizzy, sick. "No," she whispered. "My father would never." "Your father did," he stated, his voice leaving no room for doubt. "And now, a rival of mine, a man named Marcus Thorne, has somehow gotten his hands on that stolen, buried research. He thinks he's found a miracle drug. He's rebranding it, and he's about to push it through a fast-tracked FDA approval process, unaware that he is about to release a potential killer onto the market." The pieces of the puzzle began to slam into place in her mind, forming a picture so vast and so terrifying she could barely comprehend it. Her family's ruin, the takeover, this marriage, it was all connected. He finally looked her in the eye, and for the first time, she saw not a conqueror, but a man on a desperate mission. "I didn't marry you for your name, Lauren," he said, his voice a low, intense whisper. "I didn't marry you for revenge. I married you because that scar on your shoulder makes you the one living, breathing, undeniable piece of evidence of your father's fraud. You are the key to proving that cardio-regan is dangerous before Thorne can put it on the market." He paused, letting the full weight of his revelation crash down on her. "You are not my prize, Lauren," he said, his voice now quiet, but filled with a chilling purpose. "You are my secret weapon." He turned and walked toward the door, leaving her standing in the middle of the room, her mind reeling, her world completely shattered. Her plan for revenge, her hatred, her understanding of everything, it all dissolved in the face of a conspiracy so much larger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. At the door, he stopped and looked back at her. "What I've told you tonight is our secret," he said. "Now get dressed. We have work to do." The morning after the wedding night was a silent, tense affair. Lauren hadn't slept. She had sat by the window of her gilded cage, watching the sun rise over the city, her mind a chaotic storm of revelations. Her father, a fraud. Her marriage, a strategic alliance. Her own body, a piece of evidence. The hatred she had nurtured for Edward Sinclair was now a confused, tangled mess of resentment, fear, and a dawning, unwilling respect for the sheer scale of his mission. He was waiting for her in his study. The room was a testament to his mind, organized, minimalist, and formidable. He didn't greet her with small talk. He simply gestured to a chair opposite his desk. "I've compiled all my preliminary research," he said, pushing a slim, encrypted tablet across the polished desk toward her. "Everything I have on Cardio Regan, on Thorne, and on the original trial participants. I need you to go through it. You grew up in that world. You might see something I missed, a name, a connection, a detail." His tone was clinical, that of a senior partner briefing a new associate. He had revealed his entire hand, but in doing so had erected a new professional wall between them. Last night, she was his weapon. Today, she was his colleague. She spent the day locked in the study with him, the silence broken only by the soft tap of her fingers on the tablet and his quiet, intense phone calls. The proximity was a strange form of torture. She was acutely aware of him, the clean, sharp scent of his cologne, the low murmur of his voice, the way he would run a hand through his hair when he was frustrated. He was the man who had destroyed her family, the man who now controlled her life, and the man with whom she now shared the most dangerous secret of all. She scrolled through endless pages of data, chemical compounds, and redacted patient files. It was a dry, clinical story of corporate malfeasance. But then, she found something else. Tucked away in a subfolder labeled Personal, she found a single scanned document. It was a death certificate. The name on it was Dr. Alistair Finch, and the cause of death was listed as sudden cardiac arrest. Curious, she opened another file in the same folder. It was a draft of a eulogy, written in Edward's own sharp, decisive hand. It spoke of Dr. Finch not as a colleague, but as a mentor, a father figure, the man who had inspired him to become a doctor, the man who had guided him through medical school after his own father had passed away. He dedicated his life to finding a cure for the very ailment that took him, Edward had written. He believed in a world without heart disease. He believed in the promise of drugs like Cardio Regan. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't just about stopping a corporate rival. This wasn't just about exposing a fraud. This was personal, deeply, painfully personal. Edward wasn't just avenging a flawed drug. He was avenging the death of the man who had been a father to him. She quickly closed the folder, her heart pounding. He hadn't meant for her to see that. It was a raw, unguarded glimpse into the heart of the man behind the mission. The cold, calculating monster had a broken heart of his own. She didn't say anything. She kept her eyes on the tablet, pretending she hadn't seen it. But her perception of him had shifted again. The man she had sworn to ruin was driven by a grief and a loyalty that she, who was doing all of this for her own father, understood perfectly. And that shared, secret understanding was a far more dangerous connection than their marriage contract. A week later, a summons arrived in the form of a crisp, engraved invitation delivered by a stone-faced Mrs. Danvers, Edward's formidable housekeeper. His mother, the powerful and notoriously sharp-tongued matriarch of the Sinclair family, was hosting a dinner to formally meet her son's sudden bride. "Attendance is not optional," Edward stated, walking into Lauren's sitting room without knocking. He was already dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit. "My mother is a discerning woman. She will be looking for cracks in our story. Your performance tonight is crucial." "And what is our story?" Lauren asked, her voice cool. "A whirlwind romance," he replied, a flicker of dry amusement in his eyes. "We met at a charity function. I was captivated by your beauty and intelligence. You were presumably charmed by my devastating wit. We fell madly in love and couldn't bear to wait. It's a ridiculous narrative, but it's the one the press has already written for us. Our job is simply to make it believable." The dinner was held at the Sinclair ancestral home, a sprawling old money estate that made Edward's modern fortress look modest. The dining room was a minefield of antique furniture, gleaming silver, and the piercing analytical gaze of Eleanor Sinclair. Eleanor was a woman carved from ice, her elegance matched only by her intimidating intellect. She peppered Lauren with questions throughout the meal, each one a carefully disguised probe designed to find a weakness in her story. "So, you were a student of architecture, I believe?" Eleanor asked, her eyes sharp over the rim of her wine glass. "I was," Lauren replied calmly. "An interesting choice for the wife of a medical CEO. One would think your worlds are quite different." "On the contrary," Lauren said, meeting the older woman's gaze. "We both appreciate structure, precision, and the knowledge that a single flawed component can bring down the entire enterprise." The subtle double meaning of her words made Edward, who was sitting beside her, go completely still. The interrogation continued, but the final, most dangerous question came over dessert. "Tell me, Lauren," Eleanor said, leaning forward slightly. "My son is a difficult, driven man. I've seen many women try and fail to understand him. What is it exactly that you admire most about him?" The table fell silent. It was a direct challenge, a test of her ability to play the part of the loving wife. Lauren felt Edward tense beside her, ready to intervene, to spin another lie. But she didn't need his rescue. She had a truth she could use. She turned her gaze to Edward, her expression soft and seemingly adoring. "I admire his passion," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Many people see the CEO, the strategist, but I see the man who will move heaven and earth to find a cure, to fix what is broken. It's a dedication that comes from a place of deep personal conviction. And that," she concluded, her eyes holding his, "is a rare and beautiful thing to witness." The answer was so genuine, so unexpectedly insightful, that it left the entire table, including Edward, momentarily speechless. He stared at her, his mask of cool indifference completely gone, replaced by a look of raw, stunned surprise. She had used the secret she had discovered, the eulogy for his mentor, and turned it into the perfect, heartfelt answer. She had shown him that she was paying attention. They drove home in a thick, charged silence. As they stepped into the grand foyer of the mansion, he finally spoke. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice a low, rough murmur. "About my passion, about it being personal." She turned to face him, a small, triumphant smile on her lips. "I pay attention, Edward," she replied softly. He just stared at her, a reluctant, grudging respect dawning in his eyes. In that moment, she was not his weapon or his business partner. She was his equal, a player in his game who had just proven she could not only keep up, but could also see right through him. And that made her more dangerous and more fascinating than he had ever imagined. The victory at the dinner party shifted the power dynamic between them. Edward's reluctant respect was a tangible thing, a new currency in their Cold War. He started treating her less like a subordinate and more like a partner. He would ask for her opinion on his strategies, listen to her insights on the complex web of corporate relationships, and even, on occasion, offer a dry, witty comment that almost sounded like a joke. But the increased collaboration meant more time spent together, more late nights huddled over documents in his study, and a proximity that was becoming increasingly dangerous. The strain of their mission, coupled with the constant emotional tension, began to take its toll on Lauren. One afternoon, she felt the familiar, dreaded aura of a migraine begin to descend. A throbbing pain started behind her right eye, and shimmering, jagged lines began to obscure her vision. She tried to hide it, to push through the work, but the pain was escalating, becoming a blinding, nauseating wave. She excused herself, claiming she needed some air, and retreated to the dim quiet of her own rooms, hoping to ride out the storm in solitude. She lay on her bed in the darkness, a cold cloth pressed to her forehead, but the pain was relentless. A soft knock came at her door. "Lauren?" It was Edward. "I'm fine," she called out, her voice weak. "Just a headache." The door opened anyway. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the light from the hall. "A headache doesn't make your face go pale or your hands tremble," he said, his voice losing its CEO authority and taking on the calm, diagnostic tone of a doctor. He walked into the room, his presence immediately commanding the space. He didn't turn on the lights. He simply sat on the edge of her bed, his weight a solid, reassuring presence. "Migraine?" he asked softly. She could only nod, a fresh wave of pain making her wince. "Close your eyes," he instructed. He disappeared for a moment and returned with a glass of water and 2 pills. "It's a non-drowsy triptan. It will help with the inflammation." Then he took the cool cloth from her forehead, dipped it in a bowl of ice water he had brought, and gently replaced it. "Now lie back," he murmured. She did as she was told, too exhausted and in too much pain to argue. She expected him to leave, to let the medicine work. But he didn't. He moved to sit behind her on the bed. "This might help," he said. Then she felt his hands. His fingers, long and surprisingly warm, found the tense, knotted muscles at the base of her neck. With a practiced, expert pressure, he began to massage them, his touch both clinical and incredibly gentle. He knew exactly where to press, where to apply pressure to release the vice-like grip of the migraine. His thumbs moved in slow, firm circles, tracing the line of her shoulders, moving up to the sensitive points at the base of her skull. The effect was immediate, a slow, melting release of the pain she had been fighting for hours. A soft sigh of relief escaped her lips. His touch was professional, the touch of a doctor treating a patient. But the intimacy of the act was overwhelming. The scent of his clean, expensive cologne, the heat of his body so close to hers, the rhythmic pressure of his hands working their magic on her skin. It was a sensory overload. "You have a surgeon's hands," she whispered, her eyes still closed, her voice hazy with a mixture of pain, relief, and something else, something she didn't dare name. Steady, but gentle. Her personal observation made him pause. For a fraction of a second, his hands went still. When they resumed, the nature of his touch had changed. It was no longer purely clinical. There was a new, subtle tenderness to it, a hesitance. His thumb, as it brushed against the sensitive skin behind her ear, felt less like a doctor's and more like a caress. The air in the room grew thick, charged with an unspoken, dangerous electricity. He stopped abruptly. The sudden absence of his touch was a shock, leaving her skin feeling cold and strangely bereft. "Rest," he said, his voice a low, hoarse rasp, as if the single word was a struggle. He stood up and walked out of the room, closing the door softly behind him, leaving her alone in the darkness. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, the migraine forgotten, replaced by the phantom sensation of his hands on her skin and the terrifying realization that his touch had healed more than just her headache. It had breached a wall deep inside her she hadn't even known was there. The incident with the migraine created another subtle shift in their dynamic. A new, fragile awareness existed between them, born from that moment of shared vulnerability and the ghost of his touch. They were more careful around each other, the professional distance a little more forced, the silence between them a little more charged. Their carefully constructed world was put to the test a week later when they were obligated to attend a major hospital charity gala. It was a command performance, a necessary part of maintaining their public facade as the city's newest power couple. Lauren, dressed in a stunning midnight blue gown that Edward's stylist had chosen, looked every bit the part of the billionaire's wife. As she entered the glittering ballroom on Edward's arm, she felt a new confidence. This was no longer just a role she was playing. It was a life she was beginning to inhabit. They were immediately swarmed by the city's elite, but Edward was a master at navigating these shark-infested waters. He was charming, attentive, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back, a constant, warm pressure that was both for show and, she suspected, for his own reassurance. During a lull in the schmoozing, Lauren spotted a familiar face across the room. "Oh my God," she whispered, a genuine smile breaking across her face. "Is that Ben Carter?" "Doctor, Benjamin Carter," Edward corrected, his tone neutral. "He's one of the most promising young cardiologists in the country. You know him?" "We went to college together," she explained. "We were in the same study group for organic chemistry. I haven't seen him in years." Just then, Ben saw her and his face lit up. He made his way through the crowd toward them. "Lauren? Lauren Carter? I can't believe it's you," he said, his voice warm and full of genuine delight. He pulled her into a friendly, exuberant hug. "You look incredible. I heard you married the big boss," he joked, nodding respectfully at Edward. "Congratulations." "It's good to see you, Ben," she laughed, feeling a rush of warmth from seeing an old, friendly face. For the next few minutes, they fell into an easy, animated conversation, reminiscing about late-night study sessions and impossible exams. They laughed at a shared memory of a disastrous lab experiment. For a moment, Lauren forgot where she was. She was no longer Mrs. Sinclair, the wife of a billionaire on a secret mission. She was just Lauren, catching up with an old friend. She was so caught up in the moment that she didn't notice Edward's demeanor change. He stood beside her, silent, his posture rigid, his smile gone. His eyes, which had been coolly observant, were now hard as steel, fixed on Ben's hand, which was resting casually on Lauren's arm as they laughed. "Darling," Edward's voice cut through their conversation, smooth as silk, but with an underlying edge of ice. "I believe Dr. Peterson was asking for you. We shouldn't keep him waiting." He didn't wait for her reply. His arm snaked around her waist, his grip firm, almost painfully tight, and he physically pulled her away from Ben. "A pleasure, Dr. Carter," he said dismissively over his shoulder, steering Lauren toward the other side of the ballroom. The move was so abrupt, so possessive, that it left Lauren breathless. This wasn't part of their act. This wasn't a calculated move to maintain their facade. This was raw, unfiltered, and completely unexpected. When they were in a secluded alcove, away from prying eyes, she pulled away from him. "What was that?" she demanded, her voice a furious whisper. "You are my wife," he replied, his voice cold, his jaw tight. "Your attention should be on me in public." It was unseemly. "Unseemly?" she retorted, incredulous. "I was talking to an old friend, and that wasn't about public appearances. That was possessive. You looked like you wanted to rip his head off." "Don't be absurd," he snapped, but he couldn't quite meet her eyes. "Was it, Edward?" she pressed, taking a step closer, her own anger making her bold. "Were you jealous?" The word hung in the air between them, a shocking, undeniable accusation. He stared at her, his carefully constructed mask of indifference cracking, revealing the turbulent, chaotic emotion beneath. He was jealous. The cold, controlled Dr. Edward Sinclair, the man who had married her as a business transaction, was jealous of another man touching his wife. And the realization sent a thrilling, terrifying jolt through both of them. The gala was a turning point. Edward's raw, unexpected display of jealousy had shattered the professional illusion they had so carefully maintained. They were no longer just partners in a corporate conspiracy. They were a man and a woman caught in a web of unspoken attraction, and they both knew it. The atmosphere in the mansion became thick with a new, almost unbearable tension. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the ghost of her accusation. "Were you jealous?" And his lack of a denial. They avoided each other, retreating to their separate wings, the vast space of the mansion a welcome buffer against the dangerous electricity that now sparked whenever they were in the same room. Their work on the Cardio Regan case became their only refuge, a neutral territory where they could interact without acknowledging the seismic shift in their relationship. But even that was becoming fraught with peril. One night, they were working late in his study, hitting a dead end. They had mountains of circumstantial evidence, but they were missing the final, irrefutable piece of proof that would link Thorne directly to the stolen research and prove he knew about its dangers. The frustration in the room was a palpable, living thing. "This is pointless," Lauren said, throwing a file down on the desk in exasperation. "We're going in circles. Thorne is too smart. He's covered his tracks." "No one is that smart," Edward countered, his voice tight with his own frustration. He was pacing the room like a caged tiger. "There's a weak link somewhere. We're just not seeing it." "Or maybe you're just not willing to admit that your grand, perfect plan has a flaw," she shot back, her own exhaustion and the constant simmering tension finally boiling over. "Maybe you're not as in control as you think you are." He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes blazing. "And maybe you're not as committed to this as you claim. Maybe a part of you still wants to protect your father's legacy, no matter how corrupt it was." The accusation was a low blow, and it hit its mark. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. She stood up, facing him down. "I have sacrificed everything for this, for you. I gave up my name, my life, my freedom. All while you play the cold, untouchable god in your glass castle, judging everyone and feeling nothing." "Feeling nothing?" he roared, closing the space between them in 2 long strides. He was so close, she could feel the heat radiating from his body, see the fury in his dark eyes. "You think I feel nothing? I have to watch you every day, work with you, see you smile at other men, and pretend that you are just a part of a business deal. You think that's easy? You're the most arrogant, infuriating, controlling man I have ever met," she cried, her own emotions a chaotic storm. "And you," he growled, his hands coming up to grip her arms, "are the most stubborn, irritating, and utterly captivating woman I have ever had the misfortune to encounter." The anger, the frustration, the jealousy, the unspoken desire, it all converged in that single, explosive moment. The space between them crackled, the air thick and heavy. His gaze dropped to her lips, and the fury in his eyes was consumed by a raw, desperate hunger. He leaned in, and she met him halfway, rising on her toes, her hands coming up to clutch his shirt. This was it, the culmination of everything that had been building between them, the inevitable, catastrophic, beautiful collision. Their lips were a breath apart. A shrill, deafening siren suddenly ripped through the mansion. Beep, 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 the fire alarm. They sprang apart as if they'd been electrocuted, their hearts hammering in their chests. The spell was shattered, the moment obliterated by the screeching, impersonal alarm. Red lights flashed in the hallway. A recorded voice began to drone. "Fire detected. Please evacuate the building immediately." Edward, his face a mask of disbelief and pure frustration, ran a hand through his hair. "It's a false alarm," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "The system is overly sensitive. It does this sometimes." He moved to the wall panel to deactivate it, but the damage was done. The opportunity was lost. The raw, honest moment had been stolen from them, leaving them both shaken, frustrated, and aching with what had almost been. The mansion fell silent again, but the silence was different now. It was the silence of a promise unfulfilled. Hey dear, are you enjoying this story? Don't forget to hit subscribe and help us grow. Thank you for being here. The false alarm was a cruel reprieve. The screeching siren had been replaced by a silence that was 1,000 times louder, thick with the ghost of the almost kiss. They couldn't look at each other. The raw, undeniable truth of their feelings had been laid bare, and now that it was out, they had no idea what to do with it. "I should go," Lauren stammered, her voice barely a whisper. She turned and fled the study, retreating to the cold safety of her own wing. The days that followed were an agonizing, silent torture. They avoided each other completely. The work on the case ground to a halt. The mansion, once a battlefield of wills, was now a tomb, each of them haunting their separate wings, trapped in a limbo of unspoken desire and professional obligation. Lauren felt like she was suffocating. The hatred that had once fueled her was gone, replaced by a love she couldn't acknowledge for a man she couldn't have. The mission, which had once been a clear path to justice, was now a tangled mess. She was living a lie, but the lie was no longer the fake marriage. It was pretending she didn't love her own husband. She couldn't do it anymore. One afternoon, she made a decision. She couldn't stay. She couldn't live in this state of perpetual, heartbreaking tension. She packed a small bag with the few personal belongings she had brought with her. Her plan was simple. She would go to his office, tell him she was done, and walk away. She would disappear, just as she had been supposed to. She found him in his study, staring out the window at the city below, a glass of whiskey untouched on his desk. He looked tired, defeated. He didn't turn as she entered. "I came to tell you that I'm leaving," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I can't do this anymore. The case, the arrangement, all of it. I'm done." He turned slowly, and the look on his face wasn't one of anger or surprise. It was one of profound, heartbreaking resignation. "I know," he said quietly. She had expected him to argue, to command her to stay, to remind her of their contract. His quiet acceptance was more disarming than any argument could have been. "I can't win, Lauren," he said, his voice raw, vulnerable, stripped of all its usual authority. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. "I have spent my entire life controlling every variable, planning every move, but I never planned for you." He took a step toward her, his eyes, for the first time, filled not with anger or calculation, but with a desperate, pleading honesty. "This whole arrangement, it was supposed to be a means to an end. You were a tool, a weapon. I was supposed to use you to get my justice, and then you would be free, and I would go back to my cold, empty, controlled life." He stopped in front of her, his gaze searching hers. "But it's destroying me, Lauren. Pretending you're just a part of the deal. Pretending I don't feel my heart stop every time you walk into a room. Pretending that kiss we almost shared wasn't the only thing I've thought about for a week." His confession was a quiet torrent, the breaking of a dam he had spent years building. "I can't do this anymore," he whispered, echoing her own words, but his meant something entirely different. "This lie, this pretense. I fell in love with you, Lauren." The words, the ones she had dreamed of and dreaded in equal measure, hung in the air between them. "I fell in love with my brilliant, stubborn, infuriating, and utterly captivating wife," he said, his voice breaking. "And I have no idea what to do about it. I have broken my own rules. I have lost control. And I am terrified." She stared at him, speechless. The man who had forced her into this impossible situation, the man who had built his entire world on a foundation of control and emotional distance, was the first one to admit defeat. He was the first one to confess, and in his surrender, he had given her all the power. His confession echoed in the silent study, a raw, vulnerable admission that shattered the last of Lauren's defenses. The anger she had held on to, the righteous indignation that had been her shield, it all melted away, leaving only the undeniable truth of her own feelings. "How can I believe you?" she whispered, the question not an accusation but a plea for him to make it make sense, to bridge the chasm of lies and manipulation that had been the foundation of their relationship. "Everything started with a lie, Edward, a game. How do I know this isn't just another move?" "You don't," he admitted, his voice hoarse with a painful honesty. "I've given you no reason to trust me. I built this cage, and I have no right to ask you to stay in it." He took a slow, deliberate step back, physically giving her space, a symbolic release from the pressure of his presence. "The mission is over. Thorne is a ghost. You've done more than enough. You are free, Lauren. Truly free. Your father's care is endowed for life. Your family's name will be cleared when the time is right. You don't owe me anything." He was letting her go, He was offering her the one thing she thought she wanted most, her freedom. But as she looked at him, at the profound sadness in his eyes, at the man who had just dismantled his own fortress for her, she realized that freedom without him would be just another kind of prison. "I don't ask you to believe my words," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I just ask that you feel what's real, what has been real between us, in this room for weeks." He didn't move closer. He didn't try to touch her. He just stood there, his heart laid bare, waiting for her verdict. He had given her all the power, the final choice. And in his surrender, she found her own strength. She took a step toward him, then another. She closed the space he had put between them, her own fear and doubt dissolving with every step. She stopped directly in front of him, so close she could see the flicker of hope and terror in his eyes. She reached up, her hand gently touching his cheek. He flinched, as if her touch was a shock, but he didn't pull away. He leaned into her hand, his eyes closing for a brief moment. "Edward," she whispered. And then she kissed him. It was her choice, her move, her surrender. The kiss was nothing like the furious, almost kiss they had shared before. This was a conscious decision, a quiet, deliberate act of acceptance. It was a kiss that said, "I see you. I see the broken man behind the monster, and I am not afraid." It was a kiss that forgave the lies, that acknowledged the pain, and that accepted the undeniable, impossible love that had grown in the ruins of their war. He responded with a desperation that shook her to her core. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her tight against him as if he could never let her go. The kiss deepened, becoming a passionate, fervent promise. It was the real beginning of their story, a story not written in contracts or born from revenge, but one chosen, freely and completely, in the quiet of his study. Their first real kiss changed everything. The mansion, once a cold fortress, was now their sanctuary. The professional distance was gone, replaced by a deep, passionate intimacy. They were no longer just allies in a corporate war. They were partners in a love affair that was as intense as it was unexpected. They still worked on the case, but now they worked as a true team, their strategy sessions often ending in long, lingering kisses over scattered documents. But while their private world had transformed, the outside world and their enemy had not forgotten them. Marcus Thorne was a man cornered. Edward's strategic attacks had crippled his company, and the impending release of a new cardio Regan was his last desperate gamble. He knew Sinclair was behind his recent misfortunes, but he didn't know why. He grew paranoid, desperate to find a weakness, a point of leverage against the man who was systematically destroying him. And then, his private investigators brought him a piece of information that made him smile for the first time in months. They discovered the precarious health of Lauren's father, William Carter, and the quiet, exorbitant payments for his care being made by a private trust linked directly to Edward Sinclair. Thorne didn't understand the full picture, but he saw a vulnerability. He saw a pawn. One afternoon, a Mr. Smith arrived at the high-end care facility where William Carter was recovering. He introduced himself as an old colleague from the pharmaceutical world, there to pay his respects. The man was, of course, Marcus Thorne. He sat with William for an hour, his voice a venomous, sympathetic whisper. He spoke of the tragedy that had befallen Carter Pharmaceuticals. He lamented the vultures like Sinclair who prey on weakened companies. "It's a terrible thing, William," Thorne said, shaking his head sadly, "to see your daughter forced into a marriage with the very man who destroyed you. One has to wonder about the quality of care a man like that would provide to his father-in-law. It's a convenient way to silence any loose ends, isn't it?" He planted the seeds of doubt with surgical precision. He hinted that the new experimental treatments William was receiving might not be what they seemed. He suggested that Edward, having taken everything else, might now be trying to take his life, all under the guise of medical care. The psychological attack was devastating. William, already weak and emotionally fragile, was plunged into a state of terror and confusion. Later that day, a frantic, panicked call came to the mansion. It was William, his voice trembling. "Lauren, you have to get out of there," he pleaded. "He's trying to kill me. This man, your husband, he's a monster. He's poisoning me with these treatments. You have to leave him before he hurts you too." Lauren's blood ran cold. She knew immediately who was behind this. Thorne. He had gone after her father. She found Edward in his study, his face a mask of cold fury as he listened to her recount the phone call. The strategist in him took over. "He's trying to divide us, to use your father as a psychological weapon." But then the doctor emerged. The cold fury was replaced by a quiet, determined empathy. "Your father is terrified, and his fear in his condition is as dangerous as any faulty drug. We can't fight this with lawyers or threats. We have to fight it with the truth." That evening, they went to the clinic together. Edward didn't enter William's room as a CEO or as a son-in-law. He entered as a doctor. He brought no contracts, no lawyers. He brought charts, medical journals, and a tablet showing 3D renderings of William's own heart. For 2 hours he sat by William Carter's bedside. He didn't talk about business or their complicated family relationship. He spoke only as a physician. He patiently, calmly, and respectfully explained every single medication, every treatment protocol. He showed William the scans, explaining how the therapy was strengthening his heart muscle, how the blood flow was improving. He answered every question, no matter how paranoid or frightened, with a gentle, unwavering honesty. Lauren watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with a love so profound it ached. She was not watching a ruthless billionaire. She was watching a healer, a man whose greatest power was not his wealth, but his compassion and his brilliant mind. He was disarming her father's fear not with power, but with care. By the end of the meeting, William Carter was calm. The terror in his eyes had been replaced by a look of dawning, reluctant understanding. He looked from the scans to the face of the young man who had saved his life. You really are trying to help me," William whispered, a tear rolling down his cheek. "Yes, sir," Edward replied softly. "I am." In that moment, Edward hadn't just won over his father-in-law. He had proven to Lauren, beyond any doubt, the true character of the man she had fallen in love with. Thorne's failed attack on her father galvanized them. The last vestiges of their old roles, enemies, captor, captive, were burned away, leaving only a singular, united purpose. They were a team, and they were going to end this. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected place. While reviewing the original, decades-old incorporation documents for Carter Pharmaceuticals, a task she had undertaken to better understand her family's history, Lauren found it. Tucked away in an appendix was a contingent liability clause, a standard but often forgotten piece of legal boilerplate. It stipulated that if any product developed by the company was later found to have been shelved due to concealed evidence of harm, any future attempt to patent or market a derivative of that product by another entity would trigger a full, unredacted release of all original research data to the FDA. It was a legal time bomb planted by her own grandfather, a man who, despite his ambition, had a conscience. He had created a failsafe, a way to ensure that a dangerous drug could never be resurrected without scrutiny, and Marcus Thorne, in his haste to acquire the stolen formula, had never known it existed. "This is it," Lauren said, her voice trembling with excitement as she showed the clause to Edward. "This is the checkmate." They didn't go to the press. They didn't leak the story. That would have created a media circus, a public battle that would have been messy and unpredictable. Edward's methods were always more precise, more elegant, more final. He arranged a private meeting. The meeting took place not in a boardroom, but in the quiet, neutral territory of a private suite at a downtown hotel. It was just the three of them, Edward, Lauren, and a pale, visibly nervous Marcus Thorne. Thorne entered with a blustering, false confidence. "Sinclair, I assume you've come to discuss terms of surrender. My new drug is just weeks from market approval. You've lost." Edward didn't say a word. He simply gestured for Thorne to sit. He then slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was a copy of the contingent liability clause. Thorne read it. His face, which had been flushed with arrogance, slowly drained of all color. He read it again, his hands beginning to shake. He understood immediately. He was trapped. If he moved forward, the clause would trigger, the original data would be released, and he would be exposed not just as a corporate thief, but as a man willing to knowingly sell a dangerous drug. He would face criminal charges, lawsuits, and the complete and utter ruin of his reputation. "What do you want?" Thorne whispered, his voice a dry, defeated rasp. "It's very simple," Edward said, his voice calm, quiet, and utterly devoid of emotion. "You will issue a press release tomorrow morning announcing that due to unforeseen complications in the final stage of testing, you are permanently shelving your new cardiovascular drug. You will then sell the intellectual property and all related research back to a private trust I control for the sum of $1. He leaned forward slightly. "And then, Marcus, you will disappear. You will retire, move to a different country, take up gardening. I don't care. But you will never do business in this city or in this country again." He stood up, the meeting clearly over. "You have 24 hours to make your decision." Thorne sat there, a broken man, staring at the piece of paper that had just destroyed him. He didn't need 24 hours. He had already lost. Edward and Lauren walked out of the suite without looking back. There was no gloating, no triumphant celebration. Their victory wasn't a loud, explosive fanfare. It was a quiet, surgical, and absolute conclusion, achieved not through brute force, but through intelligence, patience, and a partnership that had proven to be unbreakable. The war was over. With the threat of Marcus Thorne neutralized and the ghost of Cardio Regan finally laid to rest, a strange, quiet peace settled over the mansion. The purpose that had bound them together, the secret mission that had been the entire foundation of their marriage, was gone. The contract, Lauren realized with a pang of anxiety, was now obsolete. They were free. But what did that mean? Were they now just two strangers living in the same house, their arrangement having served its purpose? The thought was a cold knot of fear in her stomach. One evening, a week after their silent victory, Edward found her in the music room. She was sitting at the grand piano, her fingers tracing a silent, melancholic melody on the keys. "I haven't heard you play in a while," he said softly from the doorway. "I haven't had much to play about," she admitted, not looking at him. He walked into the room and stood beside the piano. "That's about to change," he said. He placed a thick, leather-bound document on the piano. Her heart sank. It was the annulment papers. Of course, the deal was done. It was time for him to release his secret weapon. "I see," she said, her voice a tight, choked whisper. She couldn't bring herself to look at the papers. "No," he said gently. "I don't think you do." He reached out and turned the document around. It wasn't an annulment. It was the deed and incorporation papers for the Finch Carter Foundation, a new, heavily endowed non-profit dedicated to funding ethical medical research and providing patient advocacy. Her name was listed alongside his as co-chair. "The profits from my other ventures will fund it," he explained, his voice quiet but full of a new, hopeful energy. "And the first project will be to reopen the Cardio Regan research, to find a way to isolate the therapeutic compounds and eliminate the side effects, to finish the work your family started, and to honor the man I lost, to do it right this time." He looked at her, his eyes full of a deep, earnest sincerity. "I want to build something that heals, Lauren, not just fight, and I can't do it without you." She stared at him, speechless, tears welling in her eyes. He wasn't letting her go. He was asking her to build a new future with him. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice suddenly filled with a nervousness she had never heard before. He reached into his pocket and to her utter shock, he got down on one knee. He took her hand, his own trembling slightly. "Lauren Carter," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "Our marriage began as the worst kind of business deal. It was a contract born of revenge and desperation. It was a lie." He looked up at her, his heart in his eyes. "I want a chance to make it the truth. I want to spend the rest of my life building things with you, healing things with you. I love you, more than I ever thought it was possible to love anyone." He opened the small velvet box in his other hand. Inside was a simple, elegant diamond ring that shone with a quiet, brilliant fire. "Will you marry me, Lauren?" he asked, his voice a raw, hopeful whisper. "For real this time? No contracts, no clauses. Just you and me." Tears streamed down her face, but this time they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She couldn't speak. She could only nod, a choked sob of happiness escaping her lips. "Yes," she finally managed to breathe. "Yes, Edward, I'll marry you." Their second wedding was everything the first was not. It was a small, intimate ceremony held in the sun-drenched garden of the Sinclair estate, attended only by the few people who mattered most. There were no reporters, no business associates, only family. Lauren's father, William, his health fully restored, walked her down the aisle. His steps were steady, his face filled with a pride and happiness that had been absent for years. As he reached the small, flower-adorned altar, he placed Lauren's hand in Edward's. "You saved my life," William said to Edward, his voice thick with a gratitude that went far beyond the medical. Edward looked at Lauren, his eyes full of a profound, unwavering love. "And your daughter," he replied softly, "saved mine." The two men shook hands, not as adversaries, or as a debtor and his savior, but as family. The ghosts of the past finally laid to rest. Across the aisle, Eleanor Sinclair, the formidable matriarch, watched the ceremony with a rare, genuine smile on her face. She had been the first person Edward had told of his real proposal. She had listened quietly, and when he was finished, she had simply said, "It's about time you came to your senses, son. That girl is the best thing that has ever happened to you." Her approval, once a daunting hurdle, was now a quiet, solid foundation for their new beginning. The reception was a simple, elegant dinner on the terrace as the sun set. It was a gathering of two families, once locked in a bitter corporate war, now united by the unexpected love that had grown from its ashes. The conversation was easy, filled with laughter and stories. Eleanor, to everyone's surprise, was enthralled as Lauren described her vision for the Finch Carter Foundation's first community outreach program. William and Edward, once bitter rivals, found common ground in a deep, technical discussion about the future of pharmaceutical research. Later in the evening, Edward stood to make a toast. He raised his glass, his eyes finding Lauren's across the table. "To second chances," he said, his voice clear and full of emotion. "To finding truth in the midst of lies, to finding strength in vulnerability, and to finding love in the most unexpected of places." He looked from Lauren to her father, then to his own mother. "And to family, the one we are born into and the one we are lucky enough to choose." The air was filled with a sense of peace, of healing. The wounds of the past had not been forgotten, but they had been transformed into the foundation of a new, stronger future. The two families, once defined by ruin and revenge, were now simply one. 1 year later, the master bedroom of the Sinclair mansion was no longer in the West Wing. The invisible wall that had once separated them had been torn down, both literally and figuratively. The room was now a shared space, filled with a warmth and intimacy that had once been unimaginable. The cold, minimalist decor had been softened by Lauren's touch. A stack of art books on the nightstand, a soft woven throw on the armchair, a vase of fresh flowers on the dresser. Lauren sat on the edge of the bed, wearing one of Edward's soft white dress shirts, looking out at the city lights. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her, resting his chin on her shoulder. The easy domestic peace between them was a quiet, constant miracle. His hand came up, his fingers gently tracing the faint, silvery line on her shoulder, the scar that had started it all. "It's still here," he whispered, his lips brushing against her skin. "Yes," she replied, a soft smile on her face. She leaned back against his chest. "It's a reminder." "A reminder of the danger?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. "Of the lies? Of what I put you through?" "No," she said, turning in his arms to face him. She took his hand and placed it on her stomach, which was now gently, beautifully, rounded with the promise of their new life. "It's a reminder that sometimes our deepest scars are the very things that lead us exactly where we need to be." He looked from her eyes, shining with a love so deep it was bottomless, down to his hand resting on their unborn child. The brilliant, calculating mind of the CEO, the skilled, steady hands of the surgeon, finally understood. His greatest victory was not in a boardroom. His greatest healing was not in a hospital. It was here. It was her. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss filled with a gratitude so profound it was beyond words. He was a man who had sought to expose a flawed drug, only to find the cure for his own broken heart in the most unexpected way imaginable. And it was a cure that would last a lifetime. That's all for this chapter, my friend. I hope you felt every moment. Don't forget to subscribe and let me know in the comments what you thought. Thank you so much, and we'll see each other in the next story.